All right, we're going to wrap up our discussion about early Christianity with spending some time talking about martyrs and the persecution of the church. And there is a lot of misunderstanding about this, and some of what I say isn't going to ring true with what you've heard in the past. I can assure you it's historically accurate, and I encourage you to look up accepted sources in order to verify this. But what I want a student to come away from the section with is the ability to identify some of the reasons why Romans persecuted Christians, and to explain what role martyrdom played in early Christianity and talk about its relevance for our Christian lives, at least 21st century American Christian lives today. This discussion of persecution actually begins in the Severan dynasty of the Roman Empire. When Christianity began, it was a very small sect of about 500 people at the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, and it posed no significant threat to the Roman Empire, and as a result faced very little resistance earlier on. But while the Roman Empire was ruled by the Julio-Claudian dynasty, there was political stability, social stability, economic stability, and a small Jewish sect in Jerusalem posed little threat to the unity and stability of the Roman Empire. Occasionally there were local persecutions during this time period, governors or other prelates that decided to attack Christianity, but there was no universal widespread persecution early on in its history. Rodney Stark is a historian that has provided us some useful estimates of how Christianity grew throughout the Roman Empire. And he says in the year 40, Christians made up of just around 1,000 believers, and that constituted 0.0017% of the population of the Roman Empire, not a major threat. By the year 100, we have about 7,500 believers, and that constituted 0.0126% of the Roman Empire. Similarly, in 200, we see it growing significantly in that 1 century. Now we have 217,000 believers, which made up a 0.36%-ish of the Roman Empire. But between 200 and 250, that jumped to 1,171,000 and change, for about 2% of the population of the Roman Empire. 50 years later, by 300, it had jumped to 6,300,000-ish, which constituted about 10.5% of the Roman Empire. And by 350, after Constantine, it went from 6 million to almost 34 million, constituting almost 57% of the Roman Empire. So from the year 200 to the year 350, we see this exponential growth of Christianity. Christianity was not legalized by Constantine until 312, 313. So from 200 to 313, we have an explosion in the number of Christians in the Roman Empire. And we have a corresponding decline in the unity and stability of the Roman Empire. And what this did is it led two emperors in particular to develop what we call universal persecutions. And these were empire-wide, government-sponsored persecution of Christians. These were the only two universal persecutions. The previous persecutions had all been local. A guy like Nero, who wants someone to blame the burning of Rome on, so he tries to pin it on the Christians and does brutal and horrible things to Christians, but only Christians in Rome. That persecution did not extend into Gaul. It did not extend into Palestine. It was just in Rome. But when Christianity became an alternative way of doing things to the Roman Empire, when it started to threaten the unity and stability of the Roman Empire, Roman emperors tried to encourage unity by cracking down on this still relatively small group. The first one was by the Emperor Dacian in 250 AD, and he issued a verdict, an edict requiring everyone to sacrifice to the emperor. If you did not sacrifice to the emperor and get the sheet of paper that proved so, you were against the state. So technically speaking, he did not persecute Christians because they were Christians. He persecuted Christians because they would not give ultimate allegiance to the state. Okay. Now there were many Christians that decided that, hey, they were going to go and make the sacrifice and then ask God's forgiveness later. And Augustine had to deal with that question after Constantine. What do we do with these Christians that have fallen away and compromised their faith? Now they want to come back to the church. But we'll deal with that in Augustine. Probably the more famous universal persecution was Diocletian. Diocletian, who ruled around 300 AD, 300, realized that if Rome did not change the way it did things, it was not going to last very long. So Diocletian issued a number of changes, one of which was called the Tetrarchy. What Diocletian did is in order to stabilize the succession of emperors, to make sure that the role of emperor would get passed down in a peaceful manner, he splits the empire in half, east and west. And in each half, he created an Augustus, the person in charge, and a kind of a vice president, a Caesar. So when the Augustus passed away, the Caesar would assume duties, and then the new Augustus could appoint a new Caesar, and it theoretically should provide for a smooth, stable succession. Smooth, stable succession was important because during the Severan dynasty, you had like 30 different emperors in a 50-year time span, and everyone was at war with each other to become the next emperor. And that's not a stable, unified society. That's not a society that can expand. That's not a society that can prosper. So Diocletian instituted the Tetrarchy in order to solve the problem of succession. Diocletian tried to solve economic problems by stabilizing prices, by mandating prices. And Diocletian also tried to unify the empire by eliminating religious and political threats to it, including eliminating Christianity as a divisive force within the Roman Empire. This means that Christians were persecuted because of their threat to the unity and stability of the empire. And to a certain extent, part of what proves this is the movement of emperors after Constantine. Instead of trying to eliminate Christianity to achieve unity, they tried to promote Christianity to achieve unity. There was this point of no return where the majority of the empire was now Christian, and there was this big push to say, wow, geez, we're 56% Christian, 44% non-Christian. That's a pretty heavily divided empire. But if we can just keep this momentum of Christianity going and make sure everyone's Christian, then we can achieve unity again. So, it's not that Diocletian and Dacian were crazy for trying to eliminate Christianity. They had good political reasons for doing so. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but at least I can follow their logic. Now, let's talk about the role that martyrdom played in early Christianity. Constantine took over in 312 and legalized Christianity, made it okay to be a Christian in 312, 313. But before that, when Christians were seen as a threat to Roman unity and stability, there were periods of time at various places where they were martyred. They were killed for their faith. This was, in some communities, seen as an excellent thing that one should pursue. And I forget I believe it's Origen. There's this humorous story that Origen wanted to demonstrate his devotion to Christ. And heard that the Roman soldiers were coming through his town. So he's going to go out there and say, hey, I'm a Christian, and volunteer himself for martyrdom. Origen was in the shower, and his mom saw the Romans, knew what her beloved son was going to try and do, and stole and hid all his clothes. So while Origen may have been willing to forfeit his life for the cause of Christ, he was not apparently willing to go outdoors naked in order to do that. That would be bad. Getting killed for Christ, well, that's fine, but going outside immodestly, no, that's not how you do it. Martyrdom became a way that one could express their ultimate devotion to God. And we see this in the letters of Ignatius. Ignatius was an early Christian leader, and he was captured by the Romans and was being transported to Rome to be martyred. And in this letter he says, look, guys, do not pursue martyrdom. This is not something you should actively seek out. Now, if Christians had not actively sought out martyrdom, Ignatius would have no reason for even saying that. So, you know, by the testimony of the martyrs themselves and some of these other letters, martyrdom was something that they pursued. They saw it as a good thing. Throughout Christian history, there has always been something of a two-class system to Christianity. There's us normal Christians, and then there's super Christians. And in the early church, Christians were able to demonstrate their devotion through martyrdom. When Constantine became emperor, and martyrdom was no longer something that the Roman Empire did, then they developed monasticism, this ascetic existence where you could separate yourself from society in order to demonstrate a higher than average devotion to God. We don't have monks today, but we have missionaries. We have people that, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing or as a cynical thing, but just to demonstrate that this idea of a two-class Christianity has always been with us from the beginning of the faith, and it persists into our own day. And especially when we talk about the development of monasticism, we get to question, is this a good thing? Is this not a good thing? How should we understand the Christian life? Is there such thing as an average Christian? Or is average by definition lukewarm and lazy? Good questions. Good questions to tackle. In your reading, you get to read the story of Perpetua, Felicia and her companions, female martyrs, and what they thought about it. This was something that was not seen necessarily as a bad thing in the early church. It was seen as the normal conditions under which Christians are supposed to live. That Christians, by definition, are at odds with the society around them. And Christianity had found a very comfortable position in the early Roman Empire, being the persecuted ones. And then Christianity became a legal religion. Eventually it became the official religion of the Roman Empire and had to redefine itself. Being at odds with the culture was no longer an essential characteristic in imperial Christianity, which we'll talk about next. It was something different, and Christians had to figure out, okay, how do we live our Christian lives now that we're in the majority? How do we live our Christian lives now that culture and faith seem to go hand in hand with one another? These are great questions, and hopefully a good starting point for our discussion on martyrdom and the early church. Thank you.